For the month of February this year, we're continuing to consider the concept of love. Last week, we talked about loving neighbor and what that means. This week, we're going to consider the biblical directive to love God. For some of us, loving neighbor is easier to grasp than loving God. Maybe both seem impossible at times. Yet these two ideas, loving God and loving neighbor, form the core of most world religions. Today's scripture reading about love is ancient, from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, thousands of years old. In it, we encounter Moses teaching one of his most important lessons about life and about God. This was the very first teaching that Moses gave the people, these people escaping from Egypt, about how to live their lives, what the social order, what things were going to look like once they got to the promised land. This is what's most important. Write it on your bedpost, write it on your doorposts. I don't know if we can even imagine the biblical scene as this unfolded. Moses had just led this ragtag group of diverse ex-slaves out of Egypt. They're pagan. They believe in multiple gods. And they believe that the proper attitude to God was fear. So the first thing Moses teaches is that God is one, or God is alone, it's sometimes interpreted, and that we are to love God with our whole heart. In some ways, it's pretty straightforward, but at the same time, it's deep and it's challenging. It's a teaching that we're still struggling with to this day as a people. We're still grappling with this. The idea that God is one and that we are to love God with our entire being. And the idea that God is one and that we're to love God is presented in the original Hebrew text as two parts of the same thing. So the English translation does not really convey the original message. The idea that God is one and that we are to love God are two ways of saying the exact same thing. But in the original text, to the original audience, they would have heard these two ideas, God is one and love God, as being the same idea presented from two different angles. The connection centers around the reality that love is an experience of oneness. The idea that God is one was radical when it was introduced in Deuteronomy, because back then, people believed in multiple gods. And to ancient people, it was obvious. It was common sense that there were many gods. How could it be any other way? At this point in history, there was no acceptable way to explain lightning, for example, without Zeus. It was obvious to ancient people that there were many gods. The more important question was which of the many gods would protect you and your people. That was more the question. Yet this is the lesson that Moses taught the people, the very first and most important lesson as directed by God. Moses taught that God is one and that our approach to God should be love, could be love, two perspectives that spring from the same reality, two perspectives that spring from the same experience of God, an experience that we can still have today. But it was hard for the people at that time to grasp either of these perspectives. No, to these folks, there were many gods, certainly many of them, some helpful, no, some not. But even more pressing was that their attitude toward any of the gods, any and all gods, was not love, but it was fear. So the message that God had for these ancient people and the message that he has for us today, a people who believe in many gods, who feared those gods, this would have been mind-blowing to them. Many would have rejected it as ridiculous. It would have turned their world upside down. Not many gods, one God. Not a God to fear, but a God who is to be loved. This would upend their entire worldview, and they would have had trouble with this teaching. A lot of trouble. Like, yeah, right, kind of trouble. But it was vitally important if humankind was going to move forward spiritually. We need to get this. Humanity had been locked into a spiritual view of reality that had divided up the world into many gods, all who were to be feared. Many and fear versus one and love. This spiritual transition is so deep and so important that we continue to struggle with it to this day. Although we don't recognize it as this, but we do. Humankind is still growing. We're still evolving due to this simple teaching. Learning how to love God is required for spiritual growth, and it leads to a more fulfilling life. Putting effort into learning to love God helps us to better understand God and to better understand ourselves. Are we intentional about what we love? Do you even bother to think about your life that way? Gee, what is it that I love the most? Our actions, our attitudes, our goals in life are often dictated by what or who we love. How much time do you think you spend thinking about that? Understanding and managing what you love. It's really important from a spiritual perspective. For example, when we love money, when we love security, or physical relations, those things will be our main focus. And if we're not careful, they'll become our gods. If we love alcohol, for example, alcohol can become our god when we sink into addiction. Our addictions are things that we love more than we love God. Our addictions become what we serve instead of God, instead of serving love. Our love for many things is one of the biggest reasons why humans historically found it natural to adopt theologies involving multiple gods. I mean, yes, there was a god of beer. I mean, yeah, of course. But Moses says, hear me, listen to me, write this on your doorsteps, tell your children, talk about it in the house, hear me, God is one. And Moses goes on, and love God with your entire being. Loving God as one requires an awareness, a level of awareness, an understanding of God that is all-encompassing. It also requires that we see creation as good and worthy of love and of appreciation. If we have a faulty understanding of God, an understanding that God can't be trusted, if that's our understanding, if we fear God, then loving God becomes difficult, if not impossible. How do we fully love something that we're afraid of? In the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 4, St. John teaches that there is no fear in love. St. John teaches that perfect love drives out all fear. Moses and his teachings is moving us in that direction. As a people, moving us away from fear and towards a life of love. The spiritual practice of learning to love God leads to a healthier understanding of the concept of God, leading to a healthier relationship with life itself. If we have an unhealthy understanding, if we have an unhealthy connection to God, it will be difficult or impossible to love God or to appreciate life. That's why learning to love God is a spiritual practice, one that impacts our concept of what God is and what God is not. It's hard to love God if we don't appreciate the fact that we're alive. It starts there. Loving God is directly connected to our ability to be thankful, to be grateful, to be alive in every moment, right here, every second. Do you want to live a life like that? To be thankful and grateful in every moment? This is how it's done. Loving God is not just about loving who God is. It's also about loving what God has done, what God is doing, and what God will do in the future. And that's how loving our neighbor and even loving ourselves flows from this teaching naturally. When we truly love God, we will also naturally love our neighbor. And we'll also love ourselves with a healthy love. And I specify healthy because not all love is healthy. Christianity itself can foster a self-deprecating love if we're not careful. Christian teachings on sin and on human weakness, if not balanced with plenty of forgiveness, can lead to self-loathing that limits our ability to love ourselves or to love God in a healthy manner. A good rule of thumb is, if our love does not result in a joy to be alive, in a joy in all life, even life that's very different from us, there's something wrong with it. It's not godly love. And welcome to the club. I mean, it's what we're all struggling with. Loving ourselves requires that we learn who we are, that we face our shortcomings, that we acknowledge our limitations, that despite our sin and our problems, the fact that we are alive is miraculous. It is amazing, beyond comprehension. We are God's creations. We are not garbage. There's no way we can be garbage, no matter what. We are worthy of love. We are designed with the ability and the desire to love, to be loved, as a reflection of creation, in the image of God. If all we can see is the good, or all we can see is the bad, then our view of God will be impacted by that lens. That's an inaccurate lens. Loving ourselves means we accept the fact that we are a creation of God and that we are made in God's image, but it does not mean we are perfect. Forgiveness is central to love, including self-forgiveness. In fact, it starts there. But the fact that we can take an air, that we can look about ourselves, that we are aware, that we can communicate with one another. That we have the gift of language. This is a miracle beyond imagination, one that we cannot explain. Why we or anyone is alive. Can you explain to me why you're alive? I mean, beyond the biology. Life is grand. It's incredible, beyond imagination. Except for the fact that it's an everyday occurrence, so we take it for granted. The experience of amazement at life and awe at existence facilitates a healthy love of life, which leads to a healthy love of the universe and God. Once we understand the amazingness of our own existence, once we learn to perceive that, once we arrive at that level of understanding, we learn to love that amazingness. The good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly. And then the next step is to see that awesome reality in all of life, in the world around us, and to rejoice in it. So our spiritual fruit is joy. Our journey, our pilgrimage, is a process of learning more about ourselves as we simultaneously learn more about life, more about God, and more about the universe that we inhabit. As we grow on this journey, we become less focused on ourselves. We become less focused on our own needs and more attuned to the needs around us and the direction that the winds of love are already moving. Our spiritual journey is about growing from having many things that we love and pursue, those things that we see as best just for us, to eventually loving life on such a grand scale that we can't help but want the best for everyone and everything. The state of our spiritual growth can be measured both by how much love we have for God and neighbor and by how unconditional that love is, how pure that love is, how unselfish that love is. Learning to love God is pretty much the same thing as learning to love life at the practical level. Loving God, loving the universe is one of our goals, one of our destinations on our spiritual journey. That's why a number of us are here. Now, there are limits, right? On the flip side, loving ourselves too much without loving God leads to narcissism and a possessive and conditional love that distorts our true self and our view of the world around us. Worship, prayer, meditation, contemplation, those are all tools we use to move along this path towards loving God, towards us being an expression of love ourselves in every space that we occupy. Now, you may have noticed I tend to talk about spiritual practices a lot. That's because spiritual practices are intended to help, to heal, to prepare us to be healed by God's will, to point us in the right direction, opening ourselves up and preparing ourselves for our next encounter with the divine, which is happening right now. You're encountering the divine right now. Are you aware of that? Can you feel it? The spiritual practice that you find most useful will depend on where you are in your spiritual journey. You might think that loving God first requires a certain belief in God to proceed, and in some cases that's true, but not for everyone. Developing a sense of awe in life itself moves us in that direction no matter what our belief system is. Moving in the direction of appreciating life and the universe around us eventually leads to an experience of unconditional love, which I would describe as being touched by the Spirit. Spiritual practices take our minds off all the distractions in our lives and help us to experience and to live out this deep underlying reality of love, to set aside love for many things and replace it for love of the whole. Our spiritual efforts are about developing loving attitude towards ourselves, towards all creation, and towards God. And this involves perceiving life in new ways, in different ways, and ways demonstrated by Jesus Christ. A love for God and a love for life are incredibly important from a spiritual growth standpoint. Much of our despair, cynicism, fear, and sense of disconnection can be healed this way by learning to love God, by learning to love the universe. As we progress on our spiritual journey, loving God gradually becomes less something we do and more something we are, something we surrender to, something we gladly allow to happen. Do you remember Jesus' attitude when he was facing his own death? Jesus' love of God and his trust of God were so complete that his prayer was, not my will, your will. Not what's best for me, what's best for all. That's our example. We strive for a love and a trust of God that's that deep. Life makes it challenging. How do we love God when facing death due to a disease or the sudden loss of someone we love? Jesus showed us the way, showed us how to love God and love neighbor even when faced with death. Developing an attitude of love for God eventually becomes an experience of love. When today's text in Deuteronomy was written, Jesus was not even predicted yet. The Old Testament prophets were still far in the future. It'd be years before we as a people were ready for Jesus. I don't know if we're still ready for Jesus. Ready for a human manifestation of God, a reflection, an image of what it's like, what it looks like, making love for God that much easier to grasp. Jesus showed us the example of loving neighbor and loving God and all the healing that flows from that kind of love. In this way, Jesus offers us salvation, not just when we die, but also as we live on a moment-to-moment basis, leading to an experience of life as love, including love of neighbor, is sanctification, it is salvation, and it is the example that Jesus Christ lived. Godly love would become the message of all the prophets from Moses on. Jesus taught it. This is the most important lesson. The apostles Paul's experience of Jesus and of God led him to write things like, you need faith and you need hope and you need love and abide in these things, because that's what you'll do when you understand reality. But the greatest of these is love. Another St. John, centuries later, St. John of the Cross in 1586 wrote, my sole occupation is love. What's your sole occupation? Loving God and loving neighbor is spiritual fruit, something that we can grow, through contemplation, through prayer, through trusting God. This godly love, agape, is the concept that sits at the center of our little church. It's the concept that motivates us to welcome everyone, to serve the hungry, to engage in spiritual practices. And love is contagious when we're open to it. And it's also the most healthy way to view and experience life. The Christian religion, once we grow past selfishness and fear, is about love. About love as Jesus showed us, and about engaging in the time-tested practices that Jesus taught. Loving God results in a love for life, a love to be alive, a love that we are part of and directly connected to God and to all existence. So let's continue to take that journey together. I'm excited about it. As an inclusive Christian church focused on loving God and God's creation. In Jesus Christ. Amen.